Welcome to tonight's seminar on the rule of law and human rights in Sri Lanka. I send out a particular welcome to the asylum seekers and refugees who have come here tonight. And I'll say something special with regard to that in a moment. Can I welcome you on behalf of Amnesty International, Australian Lawyers for Human Rights, International Commission of Jurists, Australian Tamil Congress Sri Lanka Justice Forum, the Institute of Ethics, Governance and Law, a joint initiative of the United Nations University, Griffith QUT-ANU, the Centre for Asian Integrity in Manila and the O.P. Jindal Global University in Delhi, the QUT-Faculty of Law, and also on behalf of the Sisters of Mercy Brisbane congregation, who are also our hosts tonight, since we're in this beautiful theatre that belongs to the All Hallows School. Now, our speakers tonight are Gordon Weiss and Professor Charles Sampford, and they'll speak to you in that order. Before I introduce Gordon, there'll be a short film shown, and I'll come to that in a moment. Now, thank you to Ken Myers and Helping Hands for a very generous donation towards the cost of the buses that brought our refugee and asylum seeker friends here tonight. I am told, however, though, that there are some further costs associated with those buses, which I think by default Amnesty International will bear. But if you'd like to contribute to that so that Amnesty International doesn't have to divert money from their other work, then Amnesty would be happy to take a donation from you out at the Amnesty International table out there. Can I tell you also that the avid reader has copies of Gordon Weiss's book called The Cage available for sale, which, well, he'll tell you about what's in that book tonight, but obviously it's about his observations with regard to the events at the close of the Civil War of Sri Lanka in May 2009 and before and since that time. So there's those two tables out there that I urge that you visit. Can I tell you that the Australian Lawyers for Human Rights don't have a table out there, but if you're a law student or an academic lawyer, or you have a law degree or you're a practicing lawyer, then you're entitled to join Australian Lawyers for Human Rights, and you do that just by Googling ALHR, and it won't cost you anything, but we're trying to make it cost some stuff. So if you're in those categories, join as soon as you can. Now, exercising my chairperson's authority, can I say that no one is allowed to photograph the audience here tonight. I think it's quite obvious why we don't want you to do that, but please don't do that, and I'll personally throw you out if you disregard my fiat in that regard. And I think most of the introductory matters, except to tell you the way in which events will proceed tonight. Now, both Gordon and Charles will speak for half an hour each. I'll throw them out if they try to go beyond half an hour. But in the case of each of them, for those people in the audience who are not English speakers, Dr. Jeevan Santilvasan, who's a Principal Structural Engineer and Senior Technical Advisor on Structures with KBR engineering firm, Dr. Santilvasan will do a 10-minute summary in Tamil of each of the two presentations. So that has the effect that rather than stopping for a dinner break at 7:30, we'll stop probably closer to 8 o'clock. But we'd ask you to come back as quickly as possible after the dinner break, perhaps just restrict that to 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll get into the most interesting part of the evening, which is the question time, and that will continue till 9 o'clock. I think since it's still a school day tomorrow, we really can't go much beyond 9 o'clock, and people have to get home and everything. But so we'll try and cut a little bit of time out of the lunch or dinner break in that regard. Now, during the dinner break, I'll be sitting at the table over here, and if you have any questions you'd like me to put to the speakers, come and talk to me about them or write them out for me, and I will then try and put them into the discussion, the three-way discussion, which is to take place after dinner. Okay, I think that is just about everything, but don't forget to visit the tables outside again. If you can make a donation with regard to the bus fares, that would be much appreciated. And in any event, it's compulsory that you buy Gordon's book, so you better find $34.95 from somebody. And I haven't asked him this yet in case he said no, but I'm sure he'll autograph it for you if you go to the trouble of buying it. Okay, so we're going to start with a short film. Thank you, everybody.
Removing those organisations that are no longer international jurists for all time.
All of a sudden bullets were coming, like firing right into the people. You're left knowing that they're going to die. There's nothing you can do.
The government were determined to finish the LTT off militarily, no matter what it cost, including civilian lives. They didn't believe that anybody in the international community was prepared to stop them, and they were right.
When I went outside in the morning, the scene was devastating. The Sri Lankan government were targeting the civilian population.
Proceeding in Sri Lanka, it's a cover-up. It's an attempt to deny that these things took place.
There has to be a proper investigation, and if crimes have been committed, the perpetrators have to be brought to justice.
I called my family and I told her mom, this could be the last time you speak to me.
I think it's difficult to calculate how great the consequences may be if we, the world, continue this absolute failure to address the truth and the horror of what has happened in Sri Lanka.
Thank you, James. No doubt for many in the room that was particularly traumatic, and perhaps all of tonight's discussion will be particularly traumatic for people who have been very close to the tragedies about which we're talking tonight. But in our first speaker, we have someone who is also perhaps the most qualified person in the world to speak with regard to these matters. Gordon Weiss is an international relations analyst and a public affairs commentator. And as I mentioned earlier, he's the author of The Cage, The Fight for Sri Lanka and the Last Days of the Tamil Tigers. His professional working domain is countries that are in conflict, in transition, engaged in peace building, or which are dealing with collective historical memory. Now, Gordon had an assignment in Sarajevo for the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. After that, Gordon began a 12-year engagement with various United Nations agencies, in particular UNICEF, in a number of roles. And then he, in the final years of the military civil war in Sri Lanka, he was employed as the United Nations Political Communications Advisor and Spokesman. Now, tonight's seminar could really be called perhaps The Reporter and the Philosopher. And Charles will be the philosopher, and he'll talk to us about the way in which we need to think about these issues. But very much Gordon's role in the history of the last decade has been as a person who was the reporter, who was prepared to tell the truth when no one else, and in fact those people who were supposed to tell the truth, when no one else, including those, were prepared to tell the truth. And Gordon's life since May 2009 has been working to ensure that the truth that wasn't told then and still hasn't been properly told is told in the way that it should be. And his book is part of that process, and his being with us here tonight is part of that process. So please welcome him. Gordon, your time starts now.
Thanks for that very warm and very generous introduction, Stephen. How do I operate the slides, Joan? Thanks. Bring it up. And I just click on those, do I?
Yeah, just go F5, I do believe. Slideshow.
And then I just use the down arrow. That's great. Thanks very much.
Is that sound all right for everyone?
Yeah, can you all hear me? Thanks. So, good evening and thank you. I'm going to be reading from a prepared speech which I timed extremely carefully, so hopefully I'll fulfil the mandate given to me by Stephen. So thank you so much to the organisers and to my colleagues and to you for coming out, because it's a real effort to drag oneself out after work to listen to some fairly heavy-duty stuff, and particularly to the tireless Marie Clem, who encouraged me to come up and organise the entire event. It's great to be in Brisbane again after a very long time. I was last here 20 years ago. This place has changed out of sight. It's a gorgeous place. Congratulations. I'd shift here in a heartbeat from Sydney, which is a pain in the neck. As a young and diverse country, we're fortunate that we haven't experienced the kind of civil war that's torn at the heart of many countries. I've been to dozens of those countries, as Stephen mentioned, and I've lived through extensive periods in some. The UN classed Sri Lanka as a family duty station. So in 2006, I took my young family with me. We shifted from New York to Sri Lanka. And perhaps because my daughters were there, I was particularly moved by the constant fear that Sri Lankans lived with every day, and the contrast between Sri Lanka and my own country, Australia. This is a quote which I will return to. Sri Lanka has this glowing reputation as an island paradise with smiling people, white beaches, and soaring mountain tea estates. I spent a lot of my time in those areas. That's an accurate image in many ways, but equally accurate is a violent, much darker mirror image. Not many people realise that since 1971, 3 violent insurgencies have been fought against the government of Sri Lanka. resulting in the killing of tens of thousands of people each time. Murder has touched the lives of most Sri Lankans. I'll come back to this point, but you should understand that 2 of those insurgencies were fought by the majority Sinhalese community against the governments of the day. In 2006, when my family and I arrived, the country had been fighting the 3rd of these insurgent groups, the Tamil Tigers, for 25 years. Indeed, on the first day in Sri Lanka, first day that I arrived, a huge explosion racked the city centre. The Tigers had just tried to assassinate the Secretary of Defence with a suicide bomb. By then, a 2002 ceasefire was well and truly in tatters. People said that the Tigers, an extremely ruthless and bloody revolutionary group, could not be defeated by military means, and no one expected that the war would come to an end when I moved to Sri Lanka in 2006. The Tigers had targeted Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the Defence Minister that day, Defence Secretary, I'm sorry, because they believed accurately, as it transpired, that he was a dangerous and capable adversary who believed that he was the man to crush the Tamil Tigers. That's a picture of Gotabaya and his brother, Gotabaya on the left-hand side, his brother, the President, Mahinda Rajapaksa, on the right-hand side, shortly after he had survived the assassination attempt and was greeted by his brother. Over the next 3 years following that assassination attempt, the Sri Lankan army gradually took control of all the territory controlled by the Tigers. By January 2009, they had the Tigers, along with hundreds of thousands of Tamil civilians, bottled up in a small corner of the island. I should note here my view that the state was lawfully trying to reclaim its sovereign territory from a ruthless insurgent group. I could say more about that, but I won't because time is short, and I realise that will irritate a lot of people in this room, but it's best said. Whenever I returned to my home in Colombo as this war was fought between 2006 and 2009, I was always moved by the tranquility in which my daughters were being raised, because I knew that far to the north things were very different for other children and they were going to become much, much worse. I took this photo after the war in the camp that held then the 300,000 odd civilians who finally emerged from the area that had been controlled by the Tigers. Most of the senior political and military Tigers were dead, executed, as we now know, after capture and interrogation. Most of the civilians were alive, but a lot were not. How many had been killed? Well, nobody knows for sure how many civilians had been caught inside the siege area in the first place, and nobody could say for sure how many had died, and we still don't know for sure. For a long time, the government of Sri Lanka insisted that their forces had killed no civilians whatsoever. They would frequently say, we had a no civilian casualty policy in answer to any questions raised over civilian casualties. Yet this simple visual account from a 9-year-old child suggests a very different truth. Any citizen of a state should always sustain a healthy scepticism regarding the statements of politicians or bureaucrats. Unreviewable actions by government carry inherent dangers, even in the best equipped and functioning of democracies. The detention of a family of 5 for years here in Australia as a result of a hitherto unreviewable bureaucratic decision by ASIO is a case in point. It's a credit to ASIO, I must say, that they have acknowledged that error and that this week that family is free. But when a government in a troubled and historically violent place like Sri Lanka has just won a civil war, fought essentially between 2 ethnic groups, and they tell you that they killed nobody, you can be sure that they're concealing something. Especially when that government controlled the theatre of war entirely and there were virtually no independent witnesses, such as foreign journalists, such as we see today in Syria, which is a fairly well-watched war. And even more so when there's a 40-year record of mass atrocities committed by various Sri Lankan governments against their own people. Based on a number of triangulating factors, I've been saying since January 2010 that between 10 and 40,000 civilians were killed in those final months of the war in 2009. In fact, I wrote my book in order to make sense of how this happened. Several days after the end of the war, I was present when President Rajapaksa signed an agreement with the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and he gave an undertaking to the Secretary General in the old capital of the central kingdom of Kandy in the centre of Sri Lanka. Rajapaksa undertook to do two critical things in particular: to come to a political agreement to settle Tamil grievances once and for all, and to account for what happened in the final months of the war. When eventually it became clear that the Sri Lankan government wouldn't live up to this agreement, the Secretary-General appointed an international panel of jurists to assess the available evidence and to come up with an account of what had happened to civilians during those final months. These experts reported back to him in early 2011 and said that there was ample evidence of war crimes committed by both sides, that the army appeared to have been responsible for the bulk of the deaths, and, I quote from the report itself, what appears to have happened in Sri Lanka represents a grave assault on the entire regime of international law. I should say that other independent assessments assert that the number killed is far higher. Notably, incredible evidence has steadily emerged since the end of the war, supporting the view of the UN panel of experts that war crimes were committed. The government never counted on its own troops filming and distributing trophy videos and pictures of atrocities. Now, to say that things have improved since the end of the war, since the war ended in 2009, is to state the obvious. But outstanding questions remain. I'm not going to answer them here, but I do want to pose them to you before I proceed further with what I have to say. How substantial were those war crimes? Who committed them? And do the benefits of today's peace outweigh any disadvantage from digging up the past? Is today's state of peace one that will last? And is it a just peace, one that delivers justice to victims of the murder and mayhem that comes with civil wars? Does it matter if justice is denied ultimately? And lastly, the question that was posed to me by a grand old man of Australian diplomacy, and which governed the writing of my book as I sat in my little room for a year writing it, so what? And why does it matter what happened? Now, for those of you who don't know, and I think there'll be many, let me give you a very brief, potted version of how this conflict arose. The island's population is principally comprised of two ethnic groups. The Indo-European Buddhist Sinhalese make up around 3/4, while the largely Dravidian Hindu Tamils account for perhaps 20% of the island's people. There are variations on that, but that's broadly it. The two have separate alphabets and languages that are mutually unintelligible. The Tamils came from India. The state of Tamil Nadu in southern India has a population today of some 60 million Tamils. The Sinhalese are thought to have arrived in Sri Lanka sometime around 300 BC from northern India. Much is made of who was there first, but I won't even delve into that futile argument right now. Britain comes onto the scene during the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century when it annexed Sri Lanka from the Dutch. And in those days, there were probably around 800,000 people on the island, 2/3 of them Sinhalese, divided into three loosely governed kingdoms, a central and a southern Sinhalese kingdom, and then from the shaded area north, a Tamil kingdom centred around Jaffna and divided from the rest of the island by a very thick forest known as the Vani. In 1948, Britain granted independence to a very different land from the one that it had annexed. It was united as a single country for a start, and there were around 12 million people, a number that has since swollen to 22 million. Much of that huge separating forest had been cut down. Britain also left a liberal democratic political system that hung like an ill-fitting suit over a complex land divided by language, custom, class and caste. Dynastic politics quickly became a feature of political life, the latest manifestation being the current President Mahinda Rajapaksa and his siblings and cousins, who effectively control the political system and the judiciary and the administration in Sri Lanka. However, in the sea of troubled nation-state births, 1 million dead in India, bloody war in the Middle East, and the huge population transfers in Europe during following World War II, Sri Lanka's transition in 1948 was a relative island of calm. Its economic figures looked good, way ahead of both Korea and that other mixed ethnicity island, Singapore. For the first years of independence, things trundled along quite well. The British had left excellent infrastructure and an industrial base. As in Singapore and other former British colonies, administration, justice and education were conducted in English. But in 1955, Sri Lanka took an abrupt U-turn that broke this calm. That year, an ambitious Sri Lankan politician made a single rash electoral promise. And I say rash because it really seems to have been a spur-of-the-moment eve of election pitch to voters. This is Solomon Bandaranaike and his wife Sirimavo. Solomon Bandaranaike, whose wife Sirimavo and daughter Chandrika would both go on to serve as Prime Minister and President respectively of Sri Lanka, told a crowd of supporters that if elected to office, he'd make the Sinhalese language the official language of Sri Lanka. As his daughter Chandrika repeated publicly just last year, her father made a dreadful mistake. She, like most other balanced observers, blames her father's imprudent decision for the repeated communal strife that followed and for the war that indeed ended just in 2009. Surely enough, Bandaranaike, on the back of that promise, was swept into power by the Sinhalese majority vote, and in 1956, as promised, the Sinhala-only Act was passed through Parliament. Sinhalese replaced English as the language of administration, justice and education. In his autobiography, Lee Kuan Yew, the great Singaporean statesman who led his dirt-poor and ethnically divided nation to stunning prosperity, points to the Sinhala-only Act as the root cause of Sri Lanka's ensuing troubles. After Prime Minister Bandaranaike was assassinated in 1959, his wife Sirimavo, a much more transparently ethno-nationalist figure, came to dominate politics as Prime Minister for much of the 1960s and 1970s. Sirimavo set about instituting the provisions of the Sinhala-only Act, which meant that as the years rolled by, the Tamils could no longer read the licence plates on their cars, or their driver's licences, or their marriage licences for that matter. With the new constitution in 1972, when Ceylon was renamed Sri Lanka, Buddhism was given something akin to state religion status. There were also subtle changes to the national flag that diminished the place of Tamils as a constituent people. Tamils who had dominated the bureaucracy and professions under the British were required to achieve higher marks than their Sinhalese colleagues in order to enter university. The rising atmosphere of Buddhist Sinhalese triumphalism ignited a number of serious riots across Sri Lanka in 56, 58 and 77, in which hundreds of Tamils were killed. By the early 1970s, Tamils generally felt marginalised, humiliated, fearful, angered by broken political promises, and convinced that they had no real future as a distinctive people in Sri Lanka. Tamils began to organise and agitate. By the mid-1970s, a few dozen Tamil militants were even training with the Palestinian Liberation Organisation, the PLO, in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. At the same time, a handful of direct action Tamil groups had formed inside Sri Lanka. One was the Tamil Tigers, a ragtag bunch of no more than a dozen or so men. Interestingly, they drew their inspiration in part from prison encounters with Sinhalese Marxists who had mounted an insurrection in 1971. Pause for breath and absorb this. Because central to this tale is the cyclical nature of state and non-state violence going back more than 4 decades in Sri Lanka. I won't go into the 1971 insurrection much here, but suffice to say that when tens of thousands of radical Sinhalese students and monks rose and several thousand attacked police stations and army camps in 1971, Sirimavo Bandaranaike unleashed the army. Tens of thousands of young Sinhalese, including school children, were butchered. So back to the Tamil grievances. The point of no return for Tamils really came in July 1983, when one of those radical Tamil groups, the Tamil Tigers, still just a posse of politicised outlaws, ambushed and killed 13 soldiers on the Jaffna Peninsula. The following day in Colombo, Sinhalese gangs with electoral lists in their hands began to methodically pillage Tamil shops and homes. The police and army largely stood back or actively assisted. The mobs mounted roadblocks, dragging people from cars and buses and lynching them in the streets. Nobody knows quite how many Tamils were killed, but it was somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000. Many more would have died had it not been for the efforts of Sinhalese neighbours to rescue their friends from the pogrom. But the direct result of what is known as Black July was threefold. Firstly, thousands of young Tamils flocked to join those ragtag groups like the Tamil Tigers in the island's north. From a lethal nuisance, the Tamil Tigers would eventually rise to menace the very existence of the Sri Lankan state. Secondly, these are female recruits, by the way. Secondly, hundreds of thousands of Tamils and some Sinhalese left the island permanently, setting up as successful communities in countries like Australia. They would come to form the backbone of a highly organised fundraising and propagandising extra-state community that kept the Tamil Tigers fed and armed through its quarter century of armed resistance. Thirdly, India opened training camps for the various Tamil insurgent groups, training and arming them and providing them with a staging point for infiltration back into Sri Lanka. And again, there's much to be said about India's involvement in Sri Lanka, but now's not the time to go into it. So I hope I've described quite clearly that 1983 really was just the spark that lit a very combustible bonfire, built over many years. One cannot interpret the Arab Spring insurrections against tyrannous regimes by starting at the 2011 self-immolation of Mohammed Bouazizi in Tunisia. In my opinion, the Tamil revolt was a just collective response, given the failure of the state to provide security or just solutions to its citizens through good governance and civil administration. Over the next few years, the Tamil Tigers focused on wiping out the other Tamil rebel groups, consolidating their power and honing the spectacularly daring tactics that gave them global notoriety and eventually led them to control significant areas of North and East Sri Lanka. Just to add to the confusion, this, by the way, was one of a series of raids the Tamil Tigers carried out on various airports. I think they destroyed basically the entire fleet of the civil air fleet in Sri Lanka in this raid. Over the next few years, I beg your pardon, just to add to the confusion, in 1987, the same Sinhalese Marxist group that had risen in 1971 rose again, albeit in a slightly different form. For 3 years until 1990, they fought the government with a horrendous cost of probably more than 50,000 Sinhalese lives. Now, the failure of the government to account for what happened, the government of the day, by the way, a different government from the current government, the failure of the government to account for what happened to Tamil civilians in 2009 should come as no surprise, and I'll tell you why. For there has been almost no jail time served by state agents for any of the tens of thousands of extrajudicial killings of Sinhalese or Tamils from these three civil conflicts. And I mean literally none. Instead, there have been inquiries, commissions, investigations, and even occasional trials. But that's it. Sri Lanka has a long history of delay and obfuscation, or in the memorable title of an Amnesty International report, a history of make-believe inquiries. Nothing substantive has ever been done to address this history of violence. Justice, or at least in the form which we recognise it here in Australia, has never been served. So what does a history of atrocity and denial do to a nation? That's a rhetorical question. Just a few months ago, a mass grave from the second JVP uprising, and these are the typical street images from the JVP uprising that people will here in the audience will recognise. Just a few months ago, a mass grave from the second uprising, that is the 1987 to 1990 uprising and 50,000 dead, was discovered near the southern town of Matala, close to a former army camp. It was uncovered, in fact, by heavy torrential rains. The bones started rising to the surface. While the burgeoning war was being fought against the Tamils in the north in the late 1980s, the army of Sri Lanka was taking on the unruly Sinhalese in the south who supported the Marxists. Since the army was dominated by troops drawn from the Sinhalese south, this was truly a civil war, featuring acts of epic cruelty, mass killings, the beheadings and staking of victims in village squares, necklacing on beaches with burning tyres, and on one occasion even the mass execution of 300 school children led from their classroom to a grave. And just an interesting aside that I learned today, a Sinhalese friend of mine who now lives in Australia and who was just a boy at the time, was telling me this morning that when he was a journalist in Sri Lanka in the late 1990s, he came across a woman in a southern village, Sinhalese village, who was living with 11 daughters-in-law at that stage because her sons had all been killed during the JVP fratricide. One of those southern Sinhalese soldiers serving in the army was Colonel Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the man upon whom the Tamils tried to kill on the first day that I arrived in Sri Lanka. And the man who would be appointed by his brother, the president, to take on the Tigers. For some 8 months in 1989, Gotabaya commanded the local army camp where it's presumed the victims of the Matala mass grave were tortured and killed before being dumped. When Brother Mahinda Rajapaksa was elected in 2005 on the promise that he would bring the Tamil Tigers to heel, who better to ask to lead command of the armed forces than his brother Gotabaya, well schooled in fighting insurgency and with a track record of ruthlessness. So Gotabaya reorganised the army from top to bottom, and from 2006 a newly energised army began to dismantle the Tiger fighting machine. This is actually a video clip of the Sri Lankan Navy sinking one of the merchant fleet of the Tamil Tigers that they used to resupply them. They eventually sank the entire merchant fleet. I won't play it for you now, it's a bit loud. But so remember that following the 9/11 attacks on the US, there was a new impatience with liberation terrorist groups. India and the US provided intelligence to the Sri Lankans that enabled them to locate, engage and sink the so-called sea pigeons, this merchant fleet, who had kept the Tigers supplied. China, flush with cash, provided lines of credit, and Iran provided oil credits. For 2 years, the government methodically pushed the Tiger lines back without too great a cost to civilian lives. In fact, there's some good evidence that the army went to some lengths to avoid civilian casualties. For example, as revealed by one WikiLeaks cable last year, the International Red Cross said that between 2006 to 2008, the government was responsive to humanitarian concerns. The ICRC said it could cite instances in which the army had adapted tactics when informed that it was killing civilians. Nevertheless, hundreds of thousands of civilians remained trapped behind shrinking Tiger lines. Tactically, they served both as a source of recruits for the Tigers and as a buffer against all-out assault by the government, a human shield, if you will. By early 2009, when it finally became obvious that the Tigers would be defeated, these civilians were confined to an area around the size of New York Central Park in the thick of shelling and gunfire. The Sri Lankan army, and you can see the tiny area, which is really just a spit of land off the coast. These images, by the way, are drawn from my book. The Sri Lankan army was faced with a genuine dilemma: how to separate and finish off the Tamil Tigers and to spare as many civilians as possible. For the government of Sri Lanka had nothing per se to gain from killing civilians and everything to gain from pulling off an historic victory over an implacable enemy with as little bloodshed and as much military skill as possible. I believe that at this final stage, and I describe this again in my writings, that the hitherto relatively disciplined battle plan of the army vis-à-vis civilian casualties came unstuck. Unable to separate civilians from Tigers, and by now with the scent of victory in their nostrils and chasing political deadlines, the army used overwhelming firepower to achieve victory in a way that was bound to result in a disproportionate toll on civilians. This is leaving aside the very strong evidence that relates to targeted attacks on hospitals, schools, and the execution of captives and civilians, both military and civilian. Now let me jump to a quote from a Sri Lankan Tamil parliamentarian, M.A. Samantiran, who I met recently in London. And this is his quote: "In dealing with the past, we will discover who we really are. For those of us who believe that a common Sri Lankan identity which recognises the unique national identities of the island's groups is a good idea, constructing that identity in a meaningful way should also mean that we understand ourselves. Understanding the evil and brutality that have punctuated our disputes over political power is a good place to start." End of quote. His reference, of course, is not just to the Tamil insurgency, but to all the episodes of violence that have dominated Sri Lankan political life since independence. Oh, I'm over time, am I? I've got 5 minutes? Right. Despite much make-believe, the government has failed to provide a credible account for what happened to civilians at the end of the war. 2 Sri Lankan inquiries, 1 civilian and 1 military, have absolved the armed forces of any blame. And rather than devolve power to the Tamils to give them some measure of control over the administration of their daily lives and to take the wind out of those grievances that led to armed revolt in the first place, the government has indicated it plans to do the opposite. Tamil areas are instead occupied, a word incidentally used by one of the government's own former senior diplomats, who has since broken with the government. it's occupied by the Sinhalese army. On the evidence and testimony I've seen, there's no doubt in my mind that widespread human rights abuses continue in those areas occupied by the security forces. Furthermore, according to the UN Refugee Agency's latest assessment, the conditions under which a Sri Lankan might be considered a candidate for refugee asylum are actually increasing to encompass dissenting voices from the Sinhalese community as well, journalists, opposition politicians, and even homosexuals. And in a report just this March, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights noted that extrajudicial killings and disappearances continue. Then in April, the US State Department noted that major human rights abuses, including involuntary disappearances and unlawful killings by security forces and pro-government paramilitary groups, continue. In my book, published in 2011, I warned that an unaccountable government would soon turn the same instruments of control it used to win the war on its own people. Since then, President Rajapaksa has removed term limits on his own office and has concentrated administrative and judicial appointments in his own hands. He recently turfed out the Chief Justice when she tried to restrain him in several rulings. The media is tamed by attacks on journalists. The Ministry of Defence is now known as the Ministry of Defence and Urban Renewal. The army is a feature of civil society. Sri Lanka is at peace, but is restive. A group of organised radical Buddhist monks recently began a campaign to stop Sri Lanka's small and quite placid Muslim community from eating meat. One monk self-immolated in protest. Tamils have begun actively protesting about the army's seizure of Tamil lands for security purposes. I happen to believe that the lack of accountability from the ground up makes Sri Lanka a dangerous place for her own citizens. I also believe that the same failure to account for administrative decisions or for mass killings feeds a cycle of incipient violence that may well emerge again in an organised fashion. New groups of citizens, disempowered, distrustful of government, embittered by memories of past killings, may organise and fight back in the only way available to them, with violence. A final word on the boat people debate in this country. I think that the trade in human misery is wicked, self-serving and murderous. I believe our government should do all it can to deter people from making such journeys to our shores and should catch and punish those who profit. But I also believe that a large minority of Sri Lankans who make it here have a genuine fear of persecution, and we have an obligation to protect them and to treat them humanely. I personally have been deeply engaged behind the scenes to do what I can to ensure that those involved in making decisions are fully informed. Our politicians have failed to manage this complex problem, nor have they kept the Australian public honestly informed. Instead of bipartisan support for a humane, robust and coherent policy, our major political parties have engaged in point scoring. The cost has come in confusion and, most tragically of all, as many will be able to tell you in this room, in substantial and continuing loss of human life. That's pretty much it. I only wanted to leave you with this quote, which comes from a Tamil youth group, and which gives you some sense of the kind of anger that still exists out there and that I guarantee is not going to go away. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gordon, for that. Now I'm going to ask Dr. Senthil Vasan to provide a 10-minute summary of Gordon's talk for those in the room who are Tamil speaking and not English speaking. So Dr. Senthil Vasan, welcome to the podium. Your time starts now.
எல்லோருக்கும் வணக்கம். கோர்டன் வாய்ஸினுடைய உரையை தமிழிலே சுருக்கமாக கூறுகிறேன். 1971 ஆண்டு முதல் இலங்கை அரசாங்கத்துக்கு எதிராக 3 கிளர்ச்சிகள் நடந்ததும் அதில் பல்லாயிரக்கணக்கான மக்கள் கொல்லப்பட்டதும் பலருக்கு தெரியாது. அநியாய படுகொலைகள் அங்கே பலரை பாதித்திருக்கின்றது. இந்த கிளர்ச்சிகளில் 2 சிங்கள மக்களால் அரசாங்கத்துக்கு எதிராக நடத்தப்பட்டது என்பதை நீங்கள் அறிந்து கொள்ள வேண்டும். 2006ஆம் ஆண்டு கோர்டன் வாய்ஸின் குடும்பம் இலங்கைக்கு சென்ற பொழுது 3வது கிளர்ச்சி நடைபெற்றுக் கொண்டிருந்தது. அதுதான் விடுதலை புலிகளால் 25 வருடங்களாக நடத்தப்பட்ட புரட்சி. கோர்டன் வாய்ஸ் இலங்கைக்கு சென்ற பொழுது 1வது நாள் பாதுகாப்பு அமைச்சர் தற்கொலைப்படையால் கொல்லப்பட்டார். 2002ஆம் ஆண்டில் கொண்டுவரப்பட்ட சமாதான பேச்சுவார்த்தை காற்றிலே பறக்கவிடப்பட்டது. விடுதலை புலிகள் எவராலும் எதிர்க்க முடியாத ஒரு பலமான சக்தியாக இருந்தார்கள். கௌதபய ராஜபக்ஷ ஒரு திறமையானதும் ஆபத்தானதும் அரசு ஆலோசகராக இருந்ததால் விடுதலை புலிகள் அவரை தீர்த்து கட்டுவதற்கு திட்டமிட்டிருந்தார்கள். 2009 ஆண்டில் விடுதலை புலிகள் முற்றாக அழிக்கப்பட்ட முன்னர் பேருந்துகளிலும் தொடருந்துகளிலும் குண்டு வைத்து விடுவார்கள் என்ற பீதியில் மக்கள் இருந்தார்கள். ஸ்ரீலங்கா அரசாங்கம் பல தடவைகள் பொதுமக்கள் எவரும் கொல்லப்படவில்லை, இறுதிப் போரில் கொல்லப்படவில்லை என்று கூறியிருந்தாலும் 9 வயது பிள்ளைகள் கொல்லப்பட்டது போன்ற அப்பட்டமான செய்திகள் இதை பொய் என்று நிரூபித்திருக்கின்றது. கோர்டன் வாய்ஸின் கருத்துக்களின்படி 10,000க்கும் 40,000க்கும் இடையில் மக்கள் கொல்லப்பட்டிருக்கலாம் என்று எதிர்பார்க்கப்படுகிறது. போர் முடிந்து பல நாட்களுக்கு பின்னர் கண்டிய ராச்சியத்தில் ஐக்கிய நாடுகள் செயலாளருக்கும் மஹிந்த ராஜபக்ஷவுக்கும் ஒப்பந்தம் ஒன்று கைச்சாத்திட்டப்படும் பொழுது கோர்டன் வாய்ஸ் அங்கே இருந்தார். இந்த ஒப்பந்தத்தில் 2 விடயங்கள் கூறப்பட்டிருந்தன. தமிழர் பிரச்சினைக்கு அரசியல் தீர்வு காண்பது, இரண்டாவது இறுதிப் போரின் போது நடைபெற்றவைக்கு பொறுப்பேற்பது. ஸ்ரீலங்கா அரசாங்கம் இந்த ஒப்பந்தத்தை நிறைவேற்றாது என்று தெரிந்ததும் இறுதிப் போரில் நடந்தவற்றை விசாரிக்க ஐக்கிய நாடுகள் செயலாளர் ஒரு குழுவை நியமித்தார். இந்த விசேட குழுவின் அறிக்கையின்படி இலங்கை அரசாங்கமும் விடுதலை புலிகளும் பல போர்க்குற்றங்களை நடத்தியதற்கான பல ஆதாரங்கள் கண்டுபிடிக்கப்பட்டன. இலங்கை இராணுவம் 40,000 மக்களை கொன்றதுக்கு காரணமாக இருந்ததும் கண்டுபிடிக்கப்பட்டது. இங்கே பல கேள்விகள் கேட்கப்படலாம். இந்த போர்க்குற்றங்கள் எவ்வளவு பாரதூரமானவை? இவற்றை திரும்ப கிண்டி பார்ப்பதால் ஏதாவது நன்மை இருக்கிறதா? இன்று அங்கே நிலவும் அமைதி நிரந்தரமானதா? இன்று அங்கே அமைதி நிலவுகிறதா? அங்கே கொல்லப்பட்டவர்களின் குடும்பங்களுக்கு நீதி கிடைக்குமா? நீதி மறுக்கப்பட்டால் அதன் விளைவுதான் என்ன? என்ன நடந்தது என்பதை ஏன் மீட்டு பார்க்க வேண்டும்? போர்தான் முடிந்து விட்டதே என்று ஒரு வயது முதிர்ந்த ஆஸ்திரேலியன் பிரஜை பல தடவைகள் கேட்டதின் பின்னர் கோர்டன் வாய்ஸ் இந்த புத்தகத்தை எழுத வேண்டும் என்று அவருக்கு தூண்டியது. ஸ்ரீலங்காவில் 2/3 பகுதி சிங்களவர்களும் 20% தமிழர்களும் வாழ்கிறார்கள். தமிழர்களும் சிங்களவர்களும் இந்தியாவில் இருந்து வந்தாலும் யார் முதலில் வந்தார்கள் என்பது கேள்விக்குறியாகவே இருக்கின்றது. 19ஆம் நூற்றாண்டில் பிரித்தானியா இலங்கையை கைப்பற்றிய பொழுது 8 லட்சம் மக்கள் இருந்தார்கள். இவர்களில் 2/3 சிங்களவர்கள் ஆவார்கள். இவர்கள் 3 ராச்சியத்தில் இருந்தார்கள். மத்திய ராச்சியத்திலும் தெற்கு ராச்சியத்திலும் சிங்களவர்களும் வடக்கு ராச்சியத்தில் தமிழர்களும் இருந்தார்கள். வடக்கு ராச்சியத்தின் தலைநகரான யாழ்ப்பாணமும் சிங்கள ராச்சியமும் அடர்ந்த காட்டினால் பிரிக்கப்பட்டிருந்தது. 1948ஆம் ஆண்டு இலங்கைக்கு சுதந்திரம் வழங்கிய பொழுது மொழியாலும் கலாச்சாரத்தாலும் வேறுபட்ட 2 இனங்களை இணைத்து ஒரு நாடாக்கியது பிரித்தானியா. அரசியலிலே தங்கள் பரம்பரையின் செல்வாக்கை நிலைநாட்டுவதை சிங்கள அரசியல்வாதிகள் கொண்டிருந்தார்கள். ராஜபக்ஷவும் அவரது சகோதரர்களும் இதற்கு விதிவிலக்கு அல்ல. பல நாடுகளில் அழிவும் பிரச்சனைகளும் இருந்தாலும் ஸ்ரீலங்காவில் தொடக்க காலங்களில் அமைதி நிலவியது என்றே கூறலாம். 1955ஆம் ஆண்டு இது தலைகீழானது. ஸ்ரீலங்கா அரசியல்வாதிகள் தங்களுக்கு வாக்குகள் வேண்டும் என்பதற்காக ஒரு பாரதூரமான முடிவை எடுத்தார்கள். சொலமன் பண்டாரநாயக்க தன்னை தேர்தலில் வெற்றி பெற வைத்தால் தனிச்சிங்கள சட்டத்தை கொண்டு வருவேன் என்றார். கடந்த வருடம் சந்திரிகா குமாரதுங்க தனது தந்தையின் இந்த தவறால் இந்த இனவாதமும் போரும் ஏற்பட்டது என்று ஒப்புக்கொண்டுள்ளார். சொலமன் பண்டாரநாயக்க தேர்தலில் வெற்றி பெற்றார். தனிச்சிங்கள சட்டம் கொண்டு வரப்பட்டது. சிங்கப்பூரின் முன்னாள் அதிபர் லீ குவான் யூ தனிச்சிங்கள சட்டமே இலங்கையின் இனப்பிரச்சினைக்கு வித்திட்டது என்று கூறியிருக்கின்றார். பண்டாரநாயக்காவின் இறப்புக்கு பின்னர் அவர் மனைவி ஸ்ரீமாவோ பண்டாரநாயக்கா பதவிக்கு வந்து தனிச்சிங்கள சட்டத்தை அமுல்படுத்துவதில் தீவிரமானார். 1972ஆம் ஆண்டு இலங்கை ஸ்ரீலங்காவாக மாற்றப்பட்டது. தேசிய கொடியிலிருந்து தமிழர் அடையாளம் அளிக்கப்பட்டது. பிரித்தானியா ஆட்சியின் போது உயர் பதவியில் இருந்த தமிழர்கள் 72 பின்னர் சிங்களவர்களை விட அதிக மதிப்பெண்கள் பெற வேண்டியிருந்தது. 1956, 58, 77 நடைபெற்ற இனக்கலவரங்களால் பாதிக்கப்பட்ட பின்னர் பல விடுதலை இயக்கங்கள் ஆரம்பிக்கப்பட்டன. இதில் ஒன்றுதான் விடுதலை புலிகள். 1983ஆம் ஆண்டு 13 இராணுவ சிப்பாய்கள் கொல்லப்பட்டதற்கு பழிவாங்கும் முகமாக தமிழர்கள் தாக்கப்பட்டார்கள். பல்லாயிரக்கணக்கான தமிழ் இளைஞர்கள் விடுதலை இயக்கங்களில் சேர்ந்தார்கள். பல்லாயிரக்கணக்கான தமிழர்கள் வெளிநாடுகளில் போய் குடியேறினார்கள். இவர்கள் தமிழர் விடுதலை புலிகளுக்கு பிரச்சாரம் செய்வதற்கும் பண உதவி செய்வதற்கும் பலமாக இருந்தார்கள். இந்தியாவும் தமிழ் விடுதலை இயக்கங்களுக்கு பயிற்சி அளிப்பதற்கான முகாம்களை வழங்கியது. அடுத்த சில வருடங்களில் விடுதலை புலிகள் மற்ற தமிழ் விடுதலை இயக்கங்களை அழிப்பதிலும் தங்கள் சக்தியை நிலைநாட்டுவதிலும் முயற்சி செய்து கொண்டிருந்தார்கள். 1987ஆம் ஆண்டு ஜேவிபி தொடுத்த போரினால் கிட்டத்தட்ட 50,000 சிங்களவர்கள் கொல்லப்பட்டார்கள். பல ஆணைக்குழுக்களையும் விசாரணை குழுக்களையும் நிறுவியும் எதுவுமே செய்யாமல் காலத்தை கழிப்பதே ஸ்ரீலங்காவின் சரித்திரமாகும். பல ஆயிரக்கணக்கான தமிழர்களும் சிங்கள இளைஞர்களும் கொல்லப்பட்டாலும் எதுவித விசாரணையும் நடைபெறவில்லை. மாத்தளையில் சில மாதங்களுக்கு முன்னர் 1987க்கும் 90ஆம் ஆண்டுக்கும் இடையில் ஜேவிபியை சேர்ந்த 50,000க்கும் மேற்பட்ட மக்கள் கொல்லப்பட்டதற்கான சாட்சிகள் கிடைத்துள்ளன. மாத்தளையில் இந்த கொலைகள் நடந்த சமயத்தில் கௌதபாய ராஜபக்ஷ ஸ்ரீலங்காவின் தென் பகுதியில் இராணுவத்தில் இருந்தார் என்பது குறிப்பிடத்தக்கது. 2005ஆம் ஆண்டு மஹிந்த ராஜபக்ஷ பதவிக்கு வந்தபொழுது விடுதலை புலிகளை அழிப்பேன் என்ற சபதத்திற்கு இராணுவ தளபதியாக கௌதபாய ராஜபக்ஷவை போட்டதில் எதுவித ஆச்சரியமும் இல்லை. அமெரிக்க ராஜ்யத்தில் நடைபெற்ற 9/11 தாக்குதலின் பின்னர் விடுதலை இயக்கங்களை அழிப்பதற்கான நடவடிக்கைகள் மேற்கொள்ளப்பட்டுக் கொண்டிருந்தன. இந்தியாவும் அமெரிக்காவும் உளவு செய்தி வசதிகளையும் சீனா பண உதவியையும் வழங்கி தமிழீழ விடுதலை புலிகளை அழிப்பதற்கு இலங்கை அரசாங்கத்துக்கு வசதிகளை வழங்கினார்கள். விடுதலை புலிகளுக்கும் இராணுவத்திற்கும் நடுவில் சிக்கிய பொதுமக்கள் விடுதலை புலிகளுடன் இணைந்து கொண்டு அவர்களுக்கு பாதுகாப்பு வழங்கினார்கள். ஸ்ரீலங்கா அரசு ஒரு பெரிய பிரச்சனையை எதிர்நோக்கியிருந்தது. எவ்வாறு பொதுமக்களையும் விடுதலை புலிகளையும் பிரிப்பது? வெற்றி அடையப் போகின்ற வெறியில் இராணுவத்தினால் முன்னேறிய போது நிச்சயமாக பல்லாயிரக்கணக்கான மக்கள் கொல்லப்பட்டிருப்பார்கள். தமிழர்களுக்கு சுயாட்சியையும் உரிமையையும் வழங்குவதை விடுத்து அவர்களின் நிலங்களில் சிங்களவர்களை குடியேற்றுவதிலும் ஆக்கிரமிப்பதிலும் ஈடுபடுவதால் மனித உரிமை மீறல்களை இலங்கை அரசாங்கம் தொடர்ந்தும் இழைத்துக் கொண்டே இருக்கின்றது. கோர்டன் வாய்ஸ் 2011ஆம் ஆண்டு தன்னுடைய புத்தகத்தில் இதுவரை செய்த போர்க்குற்றங்களுக்கு நடவடிக்கை எடுக்காத அரசாங்கம் விரைவில் தனது சொந்த மக்கள் மீதும் கட்டுப்பாட்டையும் போர்க்குற்றங்களையும் தொடுக்கும் என்று கூறியுள்ளார். இதன் பின்னர் மஹிந்த ராஜபக்ஷ தனது பதவிக்காலத்தை வரையறையின்றி நீடிப்பதிலும் அரச பதவிகளுக்கு தங்கள் சகாக்களை நியமிப்பதிலும் ஈடுபட்டுள்ளார்கள். அண்மையில் தலைமை நீதியரசரை வேலை நீக்கம் செய்வதும் இதன் விளைவே. முஸ்லிம் மக்கள் இறைச்சி உண்பதை நிறுத்த வேண்டும் என்று புத்த பிக்குகள் ஆர்ப்பாட்டம் செய்து வருகின்றார்கள். சிங்கள இராணுவம் பாதுகாப்பு என்னும் பெயரில் தமிழர் நிலங்களை அபகரிப்பதை தமிழர்கள் தடுக்க முயல்கின்றார்கள். கோர்டன் வாய்ஸின் கருத்துப்படி போர்க்குற்றங்களுக்கு பொறுப்பேற்காத அரசு மீண்டும் இனக்கலவரம் வெடிப்பதை எவ்வாறு தடுக்க முடியும்? படகிலே இங்கே வரும் மக்களை வராமல் தடுக்க எமது அரசு நடவடிக்கை எடுக்க வேண்டும். மனிதர்களை கடத்துவதை வியாபாரமாக கொண்டுள்ளவர்களை தண்டிக்க வேண்டும். இருந்தாலும் இந்த படகில் வருபவர்களில் பெரும்பாலானோர் உண்மையாகவே அரசியல் அச்சுறுத்தல்களாலும் பீதிகளாலும் தான் இங்கே வருகின்றார்கள். அவர்களுக்கு மனித நேயத்தினால் நாங்கள் பாதுகாப்பு அளிக்க வேண்டும். ஆஸ்திரேலிய அரசாங்கமும் எதிர்க்கட்சியும் ஆஸ்திரேலிய மக்களுக்கு இந்த அகதிகளின் உண்மை நிலையை உணர்த்தி ஆதரவு வழங்குவதை விடுத்து அரசியல் லாபத்திற்காக தேர்தலில் வெற்றி பெறுவதற்கும் அரசியல் பிரச்சனையை பாவிக்கின்றார்கள். இதுவே அவர் கூறிய சுருக்கமாகும். நன்றி.
Well, thank you both to Gordon Weiss for your original address, and also thank you to Dr. Senthilvasan for very impressive summarising and translating at the same time. Thank you very much indeed. Now, our second speaker for tonight is Professor Charles Sampford. Charles has been really an imposing figure on the scene of academic law in Brisbane since he really turned upside down the teaching of law in universities when he was appointed the Foundation Dean of Law at Griffith University in March 1991. I think it's fair to say that the teaching of law at all universities in Queensland, especially southern Queensland, has really benefited from the opening of the law school at Griffith University under Charles Sampford in 1991. And then, having satisfied himself with turning things upside down, he went on to be the foundation director of the key centre for ethics, law, justice and governance in 1999 and the foundation director of the Institute for Ethics, Governance and Law, which I said earlier is a joint initiative of the United Nations University, Griffith, QUT and ANU in 2004. And obviously in that role he's contributed substantially to the debate with regard to ethics, law and governance, not only in Queensland but in Australia and in the rest of the world. And so he comes tonight to us to provide a philosophical and a broader historical perspective of the sorts of specific issues that Gordon has discussed for us. So would you please welcome Charles Sampford to the podium. Charles, your time starts now.
No problems. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to talk about sovereign impunity, human rights and the rule of law. I'm not speaking as an expert on Sri Lanka, but I'm speaking as someone whose primary interest is in the governance values that should inform the emerging global order and the institutions that could deliver them. We are used to talking about Western conceptions of governance values: liberty, equality, citizenship, democracy, human rights, sustainability, and the rule of law. But in fact, versions of these values can be found in most cultures, and we should not regard it as our job to export these values to other countries, but to engage in dialogue with those who practice and believe in highly people-centred values in other cultures. We should also recognise, and something I want to emphasise, is that authoritarian values, bad governance, is not something that we see merely in the rest of the world, but that just as all cultures have traditions of what we call good governance values, all cultures have traditions of bad governance values. And in fact, I frequently point out that the West managed to produce Nazism and Bolshevism in a single century, which, if not the two worst governance regimes in the history of humankind, they were certainly trying. So this is never a question of Western superiority. But I also want to emphasise that there is a problem of sovereign impunity which goes back to the state system that the West itself established, in which there has been a long path away from that, which has taken Western countries many centuries and is incompletely achieved in some and hardly achieved in others. I'll start by talking about sovereignty as a development in the West that extended to the rest as part of what I call the UN project. It's not a pretty story. I also want to talk about human rights, the rule of law, and maybe a little about refugees. But I want to start back at the time that Gordon talked about the three kingdoms in Sri Lanka in the 19th and indeed in the 16th and 17th centuries. There were three European kingdoms that gained footholds in the 16th and 17th century in Sri Lanka: the Portuguese and the Dutch and the British. Half a world away back in Europe, there was a more or less incessant war, what the Chinese historians might call Europe's own period of warring states. Although unlike in China, there was no eventual winner. In the late 16th century, the Habsburgs came closer than anyone, apart from Adolf Hitler, and at a time when he managed to control, the one family controlled the Holy Roman Empire, including what's now Germany, Austria, most of Italy, Belgium, swathes of France, and as well as Spain and the Americas. But they were frustrated, incidentally, by the three maritime powers who had established some foothold in Sri Lanka at that time. The wars, but these wars that I talk about, this period of warring states in Europe, the wars had strong ethnic and especially religious overtones and excuses, because often the thing is that there was persecution, appalling massacres, and what anyone would now recognise as war crimes. There were many interventions, allegedly to protect co-religionists, but generally in order to advance the interests of sovereign states. There were refugee flows, massive refugees flows, and in fact, as I point out, the French Huguenots, the Protestant refugees from France, they got on boats and they went to England and South Africa and other places where they were welcomed rather more than the refugees from Sri Lanka. But instead of the wars stopping with the victory of one party, as in China, the religious wars, the wars of intervention in Europe led to what we now recognise as a system of sovereign states. It didn't happen just in one moment in the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, but that's seen as the moment at which the moment that is seen as crystallising a movement from the 16th and the 17th centuries. It could be seen as based on the view that the consequences of intervention were so bad that it was better to let tyrants do what tyrants do, and the principle of non-intervention was born. It was seen as better to have refugees streaming over the border out of tyranny than to have troops going the other way to stop it. And for this reason, I've described the Treaty of Westphalia as a tyrant's charter, written of the tyrants, by the tyrants, for the tyrants, with apologies firstly to Abraham Lincoln and also to the United Dutch Provinces, which was the only non-tyranny to sign the treaty. The model of this, it's very important, although we talk about most states claim to protect their citizens and see that's their first right. In fact, the Westphalian sovereignty and the sovereignty that we have today is actually based upon the opposite. Sovereignty in a Westphalian system, and still in the modern state system, however much we might talk about values and principles, it's based upon the control of territory. The legal philosopher Hans Kelsen described this as that the regime that was quite by and large effective within a particular territory was treated as the sovereign. It's what I call the prior successful use of force. If you throw out the previous sovereign, then you become the sovereign. And sovereignty is maintained by a traditionally was maintained by a continued willingness and perceived willingness and capacity to use the monopoly of force against anyone who would seek to supplant them. The main threat was traditionally other tyrants or groups demanding religious or other freedoms. Members of such groups are not protected from attack, but subjected to it. If people did not like a sovereign or what was done in his or her name, then it was necessary for the sovereign to impose his will and demonstrate his authority, generally by massacring groups of subjects and gruesomely displaying their bodies until they stopped revolting. That was the Westphalian sovereignty that Europe actually had and has been practiced by many since. I think it's important I take away any great gloss on European sovereignty because that is what it was initially. And many people are much taken by the modern concept of R2P, the responsibility to protect, which is a very important development in international norms. Back in the 17th century, if there was R2P, it was a responsibility to power or a right to persecute. And that is what has been followed by sovereigns then and many of them since. There was a long journey from this Westphalian tyranny to the modern, largely liberal and democratic states that comprise much of Europe and a happily growing number of countries around the world. But it was for many a very, very long process, and it is still, as we can see, even among the best of countries, a process that is incomplete. But what's actually quite important that in international law, in the international state system, even though within an increasing number of states, the basis of sovereignty internally and constitutionally is no longer the prior successful use, but rather firstly the consent, then the active choice of the governed. If in fact that government is overthrown by a coup d'etat, then after a series of protests, it's almost universally the case that the majority of countries will actually recognise the new junta because it has managed to successfully exclude the democratically elected government. There are attempts to change this, especially in Africa, which has made huge strides in this, but nonetheless the principle of international law still recognises sovereignty based upon the control of territory, even when achieved in a highly violent fashion. So, as I say, this kind of statehood was originally only recognised by European countries of other European countries. And then, after the Second World War, the United Nations was created, and the first part of the UN project was a process of decolonisation, insistence on the right of self-determination, so that all countries could become sovereign states. Many of them, some of them moving rapidly towards liberal democracies, some of them starting to emulate 17th century European states. But of course it's also important that despite the right of self-determination, there was no right of secession. There are sort of two reasons for this. One of them is that the ethnic purity is not a particularly defensible, ethnic or religious purity is not a particularly defensible ideal for states, especially after the Second World War, despite the fact, of course, that actually the greatest ethnic cleansing was not pursued by Milosevic. It wasn't even pursued by Adolf Hitler. It was pursued by the Allied powers immediately after the Second World War, which actually created the most ethnically pure, relatively ethnically pure states Europe had ever seen. Leaving only, interestingly enough, Yugoslavia as the only genuinely multi-ethnic state in Europe. The other reason, of course, why there's no right to secession is it's extraordinarily difficult to determine, what the end of it is. And if you decide that that an area of Yugoslavia with a majority of Croats should secede, well, does that mean that an area of Croatia with a majority of Serbians should secede from Croatia, and so forth? It's better actually to try to create decent states that recognise all their populations, rather than to have ethnic purity. But on the other hand, the thing is, as I say, the UN project does not deny statehood to those who oppress their minorities, whatever form they are. Of course, there were attempts to deal with this. The second plank of the UN project is, in fact, the attempt to extend human rights across to all peoples. In fact, I often see the UN project as being all peoples, sovereign states, and all sovereign states recognisers of human rights. But in true Westphalian fashion, the first comes without an obligation to the second, or without an enforceable obligation. Because clearly, because after the Second World War, there was a body of human rights law that was established through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the various human rights conventions. There was also a body of international humanitarian law, which from the Hague and Geneva Conventions, all of which Sri Lanka signed. But of course, all of these things were noble declarations by states, but there was no enforcement mechanism until at least the Rome Statute, as most of you probably know, sets up the International Criminal Court. But the numbers of states that have signed up to the International Criminal Court includes most of those who would not be likely to be subject to it, and there are notable holdouts, particularly among strong states, including the majority of the P5, and particularly, of course, the United States, China and Russia. And so that if you sign up to the Rome Statute, as you probably know, it means that you have a duty to prosecute breaches of stated crimes, including breaches of international humanitarian law, crimes against humanity, and even now, actually, the crime of aggression from 2017. But unless you sign up to the International Criminal Court, you have a duty to prosecute such crimes conducted on your own territory or by your own citizens, and if you inadequately prosecute it, then in that case the International Criminal Court in The Hague can actually take over the prosecution of those citizens. Sri Lanka is not a signatory to the Rome Statute. So what can we do? One can press for actions by the United Nations Security Council for smart sanctions, even to press them to engage in responsibility to protect interventions. We can also press for all countries to sign the Rome Statute. There is an alternative to get the United Nations Security Council to refer a matter to the International Criminal Court. The only problem is, the thing is, it's incredibly hypocritical for the United States, which is the principal mover in these things, as it was in Sudan, to be insisting that the heads of other sovereign states and those within other sovereign states should be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court when they themselves are not prepared to sign the statute and to subject their own citizens and soldiers to this. It's actually one of those things that hypocrisy has a price, and the price of hypocrisy in this is ineffectiveness. And so that whereas it's possible, it would be possible for the Security Council to refer Sri Lanka or other offenders to, or potential or alleged offenders, before the International Criminal Court. As a matter of fact, sovereign impunity remains today as it was in the 17th century. The other thing we talked about sovereignty and sovereign impunity, we've talked about human rights, talked about also the rule of law. One of the most interesting international agreements, was the World Summit held in the General Assembly in 2005. There was a lot of debate about the rule of law. The northern states wanted to insist that the World Summit would endorse the rule of law in domestic affairs, the kind of rule of law we're actually used to seeing within countries. Many members of the South, the group of 66, said, well, actually, we'd actually rather like it if the powerful states, especially the United States, of course, would recognise the rule of law in international affairs. And they actually came to a compromise. Normally, compromises on the floor of the General Assembly water down all proposals in such a way that you wonder whether it would be better not to have voted at all. In this case, they actually did the opposite. They actually agreed, the compromise was that they'd actually agree to both. That all world leaders at the General Assembly agreed that they should follow the rule of law both in domestic affairs and in international affairs. The only problem is, of course, is that there was no enforcement mechanism. This was an undertaking, and of course I think that one must genuinely recognise that many of those countries would not have dreamt of voting for that resolution if in fact they thought they'd actually be forced to comply with it. But nonetheless, the thing is, it's a very important declaration, and it's one in which ultimately we should seek to bring states to account. And we've been doing a large project with the United Nations University and the United Nations itself, which has a rule of law unit, trying to think, how can you bring the rule of law to international affairs? How can you ensure that international humanitarian law will be effective? And how can you ensure that that human rights, international law, the rule of law will be followed domestically? One thing we've actually tried to do in concentrating on the international rule of law is to look at how the rule of law developed in those countries that now have a long tradition of it. The first thing, of course, to recognise is it often took a very long time, much longer than the time from Sri Lankan independence to today. This is not an excuse for acting more slowly. It is just a recognition that we should not appear and feel superior as Western nations because we expect others to follow what we imagine we follow ourselves, and often fail to do so anyway. But if you look at how the rule of law developed domestically, there are a number of institutional supports, but also there is actually in terms of an independent judiciary, free elections and so forth. But also there is very important ethical supports. The key actors believed in the rule of law, whether they be politicians, civil servants, soldiers and of course lawyers. If you actually look at the history of how the rule of law developed in places like England, where much of the tradition came from. Lawyers, not surprisingly, believed in the rule of law. You might see it as a sort of almost as a union activity. But in fact, of course, the thing is that lawyers, if lawyers actually had a religion, the rule of law would be at the absolute centre of it. And they take it very, very seriously, and some of them are taking great risks to follow the rule of law. Civil servants are also really important in a country with effective rule of law. Civil servants know their act better than the politicians or even the lawyers, because they know that the only source of power is the power that comes from the law that gives them the power to act. And no law, no power, no action, as a good civil servant should say to his or her minister. Soldiers were also absolutely critical. As I said, the thing is actually one of the great problems of the modern state is that there were standing armies, and so coup d'etat became, if you like, a disease of the modern state. But increasingly in countries subject to the rule of law, soldiers considered themselves subject to the law. And that firstly, as far as constitutional control, and secondly, that they could only act when they had the power, and often they were very restricted from acting in the aid to the civil power, but also, very importantly, that they were subject to the law themselves, and that they had no rights to act outside of the law to take over that sovereign territory. They had to protect sovereignty, not attack it. And one of the hopeful developments is that with globalisation, lawyers, politicians, civil servants and soldiers are not just acting within sovereign states. It's another story I could tell, but one of the interesting things is that before the Treaty of Westphalia, lawyers and soldiers were among the most cosmopolitan professions. They became, with the rise of sovereign states, some of the most domesticated professions. But now, with the internationalisation of law, lawyers are becoming very much an international profession. With the increasing rise of peacekeeping and peace operations, soldiers are becoming more and more a global profession. And I think that the rule of law should be seen as central to the role of the professional role of lawyers, the professional role of soldiers, the professional role of international civil servants, and of course when it comes to politicians. And I think a very important element of this is to recognise that if you don't accept the rule of law domestically and internationally, then you should not be recognised by other lawyers as a lawyer. If you do not recognise the rule of law domestically and internationally, you should not be recognised as a politician by other politicians. And if you are not prepared to subject your own actions to international humanitarian law and other relevant laws, then other soldiers should not recognise you as a professional soldier. I'm not saying you go around and shoot them. You just say that you are not a soldier if you do not accept not only the domestic rule of law, but also the rule of law internationally. And I think that it's, I don't want to emphasise that this is all just about people-to-people respect and recognition, but I think it's a very important part of it. I want to build the institutions, but I think that an important, but we have to wait for the international agreements to create the institutions that will, in all cases, bring to account those who breach human rights law, breach constitutionalism and the rule of law domestically or internationally. But I think an important part of it is recognising that the rule of law and respect for key ideals of international law as recognised in the conventions, in the Hague and Geneva conventions, recognising in the World Summit of 2005. These are values that if you don't hold to them, you are not recognised as a soldier, a politician and so forth. I think it's very important that the United Nations should not accept any soldiers who do not accept these principles. And when it comes to the kind of treatment that Gordon talked about, the way the Chief Justice of Sri Lanka was impeached and driven out, and the most appalling process. the Chief Justice was, and this in many ways is of much less consequence than the shooting of children and the shelling of children, women and children. But it sort of shows about how it goes to the very heart of some regimes. Apparently the Chief Justice ruled that some of the acts were constitutional. So she was charged with, among other things, actually misinterpreting the Constitution. And there was a group of 11 parliamentarians, including 7 ministers, whose acts had been ruled unconstitutional, and they actually went through this amazing kangaroo court in which she was given 1,000 pages of evidence, given a response to respond the next day, told she couldn't have any witnesses, then witnesses were produced against her. It was, in fact, one of the interesting things is when somebody engages in such an absolute travesty of justice and refuses to accept any kind of independent courts rulings over their own decisions and over their own actions within their own shores. It shows the contempt that they show, and also the extent to which they believe that their power is quite unchecked. I think it's very important that so that when we say that you are not a professional politician because you do not accept the rule of law within your own country, and because you throw out your judges in those ways, because you will not engage in meaningful investigation of serious allegations of war crimes within your country. This is when the suggestions that Chogyam shouldn't go to Sri Lanka, and we shouldn't recognise them, and I would also argue, is that a Chief Justice who replaces another Chief Justice who's thrown out in a clearly unconstitutional manner, a manner in fact which was ruled unconstitutional but by the remaining members of the Supreme Court. We should recognise that these are not, that's fine, we should recognise that these are not lawyers. And we should say, I'm sorry, that's fine, you call yourself whatever you want, but as far as we're not concerned, you don't hold the values of us as lawyers, you don't hold the values of us as politicians, and we don't want you there. And I think that this is part of it. If like the globalisation of professions is an important part. And then, of course, it's a question of building the institutions that ensure that those who have broken these very important human rights laws and international humanitarian laws are brought to justice. I talk about and I'm going to finish on one point. A lot of I'm talking about the rule of law, and many people might say, well, what about the presumption of innocence? You're saying that there's been this gross breach of constitutional law by the President of Sri Lanka. Well, that's actually quite easy because the Supreme Court has actually decided that. But when it comes to sort of other breaches, there's sort of a game that says, well, I'm innocent until proven guilty, and I'm not going to allow a trial. So therefore I remain permanently innocent because I won't allow myself to be proven guilty. My view about this, I want to express this very strongly, is that the presumption of innocence is part of the criminal justice process. It's part of the rights you have to a fair trial. It's part of the rule of law. But if you don't accept the jurisdiction of a competent court to do it, then you don't get to insist on the presumption of innocence. Because in a sense, we as other citizens, as lawyers, I think it's right if somebody is subject to judicial process, a fair judicial process, we wait until that process is concluded to come to that conclusion. But if in fact there is going to be no such court, we can't suspend judgment indefinitely. We have to look at it as a prima facie case. And we actually take quite seriously the fact that somebody will not accept adjudication by a competent court in a fair trial is actually a reason to believe they may actually be guilty. You're not certain about it, but the thing is that you've got to operate on that prima facie case. And when, of course, there are independent tribunals, and I think it's very important that we have here independent international tribunals, and where there aren't, I think NGOs should set them up and look at their best evidence. And I say that if in fact there's an independent panel which finds that somebody is likely to have been guilty, or a particular group is likely to be guilty of war crimes, then we've got to treat this as prima facie, and until they stand trial, and still they're prepared to stand trial, then we have to reach our own conclusions. I've often said that those who are accused of war crimes, whether they be the traditional ones in jus in bello or actually crimes of aggression, they deserve fair trial. No less, but no more. They deserve a trial among their peers, conducted in fairness in a way that they, even if they themselves do not conduct fair trials, they are entitled to a fair trial, but they are entitled to a trial if there's a prima facie case and that's established by an international, even NGO tribunal. And until they do, we are actually entitled to say that they are guilty, and their refusal to start an independent and fair judicial process is actually further evidence. Not conclusive evidence, but we cannot wait for them to decide, because it's too easy to say, well, I'm innocent until proven guilty, there'll be no trial, therefore I can't be proven guilty. No, it works the other way around. And I think we should, as global citizens and as members of relevant professions, continue to say that and to work together to build the institutions so that there is no option as to whether you engage in a fair subject yourself to a fair trial. And sovereign impunity, started in 1648, will end forever.
Thanks for that, Charles, that very interesting analysis of history, the development of values, the development of law. Interesting as it is, I'm glad it's not my duty to summarise it in less than 10 minutes and translate it into another language. So I'll ask Jeevan Santil to come up again and do exactly that. So welcome him to the podium, please.
Right, Charles had given me a much harder task now. It's over the top for me. So I'm going to be a little bit embarrassed in here if people can understand Tamil and English. தமிழும் ஆங்கிலமும் புரிபவர்களுக்கு நான் என்ன சொல்லுகிறேன் என்று புரியும். இது மிகவும் ஒரு கடினமான விடயம், இருந்தாலும் நான் முயற்சி செய்கிறேன். இறையாண்மையை பற்றியும் மேற்கத்திய நாடுகளில் உள்ள இறையாண்மையை பற்றியும் சார்ஸ் கூறியிருந்தார். அனைத்து கலாச்சாரங்களிலும் அனர்த்தங்கள் நடந்துள்ளன. போல்ஷெவிக் ரெவல்யூஷன் ருஷ்ய நாட்டிலே நடைபெற்றது, நாட்சி போர் நடைபெற்றது, ஜெர்மனியிலும் ஐரோப்பிய நாடுகளிலும் நடைபெற்றது. அதை பற்றி அவர் கூறியிருந்தார். அதன் பின்னர் ஐரோப்பிய நாடுகளில் எவ்வாறு இறையாண்மை நிலைநாட்டப்பட்டது என்பதை பற்றி கூறியிருந்தார். கோர்டன் பாய்ஸ் 3 ராஜ்யங்களை பற்றி கூறியிருந்தால் அதே வேளையில் சார்ல்ஸ் வந்து 3 நாடுகளின் கட்டுப்பாட்டின் கீழ் இலங்கை இருந்ததை பற்றி கூறியிருந்தார். ஐரோப்பாவில் போர் முடிவுக்கு வந்தபொழுது இறையாண்மை அடைவதற்கு எவ்வளவு காலம் எடுத்தது என்பதை பற்றி கூறியிருந்தார். அதே வேளையில் அகதிகளின் ஒரு நாட்டிலிருந்து இன்னொரு நாட்டுக்கு அகதிகளாக செல்வது எதுவும் புதிதல்ல. பிரான்ஸ் நாட்டிலிருந்து உலகப் போர் நடந்த காலங்களில் அகதிகளாக மற்ற நாடுகளுக்கு சென்றிருந்ததை பற்றி கூறியிருந்தார். சர்வதேச இறையாண்மையில் நிலப்பரப்புகளை ஆளுவது என்பது ஒரு முக்கியமான இடத்தை பெறுகிறது என்று கூறியிருந்தார். ஐக்கிய நாடுகளின் முக்கிய நோக்கம் உலக நாடுகளிலே சுய உரிமையையும் மக்கள் ஆட்சியையும் நிலைநிறுத்துவது முதலாவதாகவும், இரண்டாவதாக மனித உரிமைகளை பேணி பாதுகாப்பது என்பது இரண்டாவதாக இருக்கிறதாகவும் கூறினார். இதற்காக நிர்ணயிக்கப்பட்ட ஜெனீவா ஒப்பந்தத்திலும் வேறு சில ஒப்பந்தங்களிலும் இலங்கை அரசாங்கம் கைச்சாத்திட்டிருந்தாலும் அதை நிறைவேற்ற தவறி இருப்பது என்பதை பற்றி கூறியிருந்தார். இதற்கு மற்ற நாடுகள், இலங்கையில் நடைபெறுகின்ற அனர்த்தங்களுக்கு மற்ற நாடுகள் செய்யக்கூடியவை என்ன என்று எதிர்பார்க்கும் பொழுது கட்டுப்பாடுகளை விதிக்க முடியும் என்பதை பற்றி கூறியிருந்தார். சர்வதேச நீதிமன்றத்திற்கு எடுத்து செல்வதை பற்றி கூறியிருந்தார். சட்ட விதிமுறைகளை எவ்வாறு அமுல்படுத்தப்படலாம், சரியான இறையாண்மை உலக நாடுகளில் அமுல்படுத்தப்படுவதற்கு நீண்ட காலங்கள் எடுத்தன. இவற்றை பற்றி அரச ஊழியர்கள், இராணுவ படை, சட்ட வல்லுநர்கள் அந்தந்த நாடுகளிலே அறிவார்கள். அமைதிப்படையின் மூலம் இராணுவம் அந்த சட்ட விதிமுறைகளை நிலைநாட்டி கொண்டிருக்கின்றன. சட்ட வல்லுநர்கள் சர்வதேச சட்டங்களை படித்து அதன் மூலம் இறையாண்மையை நிலைநாட்டுவதற்காக பாடுபட்டு கொண்டிருக்கின்றார்கள். இறுதியில் தலைமை நீதியரசர் வேலைநீக்கம் செய்யப்பட்டது இலங்கையில் எவ்வாறு அதை தண்டிக்கப்பட வேண்டும் என்பதை கூறியிருந்தார். நீதியரசர் என்பவர் அரசியல் சாசனத்தை எழுதுபவர்கள் அல்லது திருத்துபவர்கள், அவர்களை வேலையிலிருந்து நீக்குவது எவ்வளவு ஒரு பாரதூரமான குற்றம் என்பதை பற்றியும் அவர் கூறியிருந்தார். இதுவே என்னுடைய சிறிய சுருக்கமான உரை. நன்றி.
Thank you, Dr. Senthilvasan, for that excellent tackling of a difficult task. Now, I'm going to let you go out and have something to eat in a moment, but just in case some of you have got time constraints and come back and can't come back, I'm going to give you an opportunity now to thank a number of people. I'm not sure that I've got the full list, but I'll do the best I can with what I've got. Again, I'd like to thank All Hallows and the Sisters of Mercy Brisbane congregation for allowing us the use of these facilities free of charge. And for those sisters from the congregation who have supported us by being in the audience tonight. Thank you to Red Cross and Communify, as well as Helping Hands, who I mentioned earlier, for assisting with the transport of asylum seekers and refugees. Thank you to Amnesty International and Tia Lancaster, who handle all the registrations, which is, as you know, one of the shittiest jobs associated with running any event. So thank you, Tia, for dealing with that. Thank you to Jessica Thrower for arranging the video that we saw at the beginning. And thank you to the organising committee. And again, I haven't got all of those, but as Gordon mentioned, Marie Clem brought it all together and made sure that it worked. So thank you, Marie, but also Benedict Coyne and a number of other people, including Sean Reedy from Australian Lawyers for Human Rights, Krish Ilinku from the Tamil community and the Tamil organisations in Brisbane, Wayne Sanderson from Amnesty, who's also been behind the counter out there, and among our volunteers, James Gibney, who's helped with the setting up today and tonight, and yesterday I think as well. So that's just about everybody on my list. Can I just urge you again to go and buy Gordon's book, take those cards with you and fill them in before you come back in and hand them to somebody else. They'll post them for you, sign the petitions and grab something to eat and be back in here in about 15 minutes. So go for it. And yes, if you want any questions raised in the discussion afterwards, come and see me during the break. Tell me what you'd like particularly to be discussed, and if I think it's particularly interesting, I'll pass it on to the speakers. Thank you. The Sunday morning session at a weekend conference, or the session at a week-long conference that's after the conference dinner. So the fact that we've got quite a lot of people coming back, I think is something of an achievement. Now, when I started looking at all the questions you started throwing in my direction, I thought, maybe I'll take Dr. Santil's job and translate into Tamil. Might be easier. But we'll see how we go. There's a number of different themes that come up in the questions, and we'll try and touch upon each of those themes. As I said, I think we should stop at 9 o'clock, because it is a school night, and I'm also going to ask Dr. Santil to summarise at various passages. We'll just play that by ear as we go along. Now, the first series of questions, Gordon, I might call the can of worms questions, and they relate to two areas that come from your discussion, and Maybe that you've just pressed on a few little areas of sensitivity, but I'll see if I can express them in these two ways, and then you and Charles can decide to take them where you'd like to. Part of it comes from the thing that you said about what you thought when you first landed in Colombo, and the right of the government to retake territory, and to place that alongside also the historical situation of the Tamil people as a result of the events, certainly since independence in the late 1940s, and particularly since the events in 1983. So that's sort of one half of the questions, and I think this is a pointless exercise, and I say that in the sense that we come down to casting historical blame everywhere and saying who's bad and who's good. Right? You're the one who has to answer the question, so it doesn't really worry me. And the other part relates to the events of leading up to May 2009. And the proposition is put possibly in this way, well, this is the bluntest way of putting it, is that that many civilians wouldn't have been there if they really didn't want to be there. If people really wanted to flee across the lines, even if the Tamil Tigers had been shooting some people by way of example, there wouldn't have been that many people there under the bombs when you consider how large the area was, how much it had shrunk, and all the other stuff that the Tamil Tigers were dealing with at that stage. So I think at the heart of this question is, even if we accept all of the terrible things that the Tamil Tigers did during their history, including establishing their dominance within the Tamil community by violence against other Tamil groups at times, even if we take all of that into account, what is it about life in Sri Lanka and life in the diaspora that makes it desirable for people to support the Tigers and the memory of the Tigers in circumstances where you think a logical analysis might say they don't deserve that kind of support. That's a pretty slanted way of putting it, but that's probably the harshest way of putting it. Over to you and Charles.
Do you want to answer the sort of sovereignty question? I mean,
Have I got that question right? A couple of people saying that question.
This basically is Gordon, but he asked me to answer first. Basically, I mean, the sovereignty thing, that there isn't a right to secession, which is extraordinarily difficult. In fact, the answer to the demands for secession should actually be the full recognition of the human rights of the members of those communities. That is the only answer, because it's impossible to slice and dice existing countries. In fact, I used to say that those who try to correct the accidents of history that create borders often create the great tragedies of history. So there's a responsibility on the sovereign state, which is something which is accepted because in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and so forth, but not actually followed. And one of the questions, therefore, is, of course, what are the institutional and ethical mechanisms to try to make it that people do respect the human rights of their citizens so they don't feel that they have to rebel? Because secession is normally very messy and often, as I say, it doesn't have a particular end. The other thing, of course, is that there are lots of, there is a question as to whether, in fact, the use of force was proportionate, and it was obviously very difficult in lots of ways to. And I don't know what the facts are, because there's a. But this is where you want a fair trial. The Tamil Tigers deserve a fair trial rather than summary execution, and the soldiers, of which there is serious concerns, especially backed up by international panels. They deserve a fair trial too, but no less, but no more, because these are genuinely difficult questions. When I look at it, you could see, you could see a case to be made that, however bad it was, that in fact that this was necessary and proportionate. They could argue that. The fact that they're not prepared to argue it in front of an independent tribunal makes one suspicious that there is a good defence, but they're entitled to put that defence before a fair trial, and if they don't, well, we'll make our presumptions, as I said.
Yeah, I mean, when I talk about going there as a supporter of the government's right to retake its territory, I'm speaking in very narrow black and white terms as a UN civil servant. You know, we're invited there as guests of the government, and therefore formally one recognises the accepted legal position, which is that the government had a right to take on to regain its territory. That's absolutely contradicted by another position that I made fairly plain, which was that in my view the Tamil rebellion was a just rebellion. So those things don't sit easily with one another, you know, it's useless trying to reach for a simple narrative in the Sri Lankan context as it is. As we are swiftly learning, it is a big mistake to reach for a simple narrative in the Syrian context and many other contexts. But the other thing, as I say, is just to give you the sort of broader framework, is that when I left to write my left the UN to write my book, I had a very particular purpose in mind. It wasn't chasing the glory of writing a book, or because I thought I was going to make a lot of money from writing a book, or I thought that leaving the UN at the height of the global financial crisis was an excellent career move. It was because I believed that there had been mass atrocities committed, and that as a civil servant on the ground, I bore my share of responsibility to not just ignore that. And when I wrote my book, I wrote it not as a piece of rah-rah to join, the sort of, to be really bolshy and complain about, how awful people are in the world. I was attempting to reach the broadest possible audience of people, and in particular policymakers, so that they would understand what had actually happened in Sri Lanka, the roots of the problem, and how that problem might be addressed. So if someone wants me to stand up and talk about, was it the case that the Tamil, was it the case that most people remained behind with the Tamil Tigers because they wanted to? Yeah, I mean, I could argue that, and we could bat that backward and forward a little bit, but it's not really relevant in terms of this person and the role that I have had in trying to explain the war in Sri Lanka. So there are certain things that I simply won't say publicly. I might say them in private conversations, but I wouldn't say that publicly because it's not what I set out to do, and it's not my role. I hope that sort of explains it to some extent.
Dr. Senthil, would you like to just give the non-English speaking audience a little bit of a feel for that discussion?
இந்த நாட்டிலே போர் நடந்த பொழுது மக்கள் விடுதலை புலிகளுக்கும் அரசாங்கத்துக்கும் இடையில் மாட்டிக்கொண்டிருந்தாலும் விடுதலை புலிகளுக்கு சார்பாக இருந்தார்கள் என்பதும் இருந்தாலும் அதற்கான காரணம் என்ன, அவர்கள் விடுதலை புலிகளுடன் இருப்பதற்கான காரணம் என்ன என்ற கேள்விக்கு கோர்டன் வாய்ஸ் தன்னுடைய புத்தகத்தில் அதை எவ்வாறு குறிப்பிட்டிருந்தார் என்பதை கேட்டிருந்தார்கள். மக்கள் பலவந்தமாக, சார்ஸ் கூறியது போல மக்கள் பலவந்தமாக நிறுத்தப்பட்டிருந்தால் அது போர்க்குற்றங்கள் விசாரிக்கப்பட வேண்டிய ஒன்று, விடுதலை புலிகளாக இருந்தாலும் சரி, அரசாங்கமாக இருந்தாலும் சரி, விசாரிக்கப்பட வேண்டிய ஒன்று. சுயாதீன ஆணைக்குழு ஒன்றை அரசாங்கம் விசாரணைக்கு எடுத்துக்கொள்ளாததிலிருந்து அவர்களில் எங்களுக்கு சந்தேகம் வரக்கூடிய ஒரு நிலைமை இருக்கின்றது என்று கூறியிருந்தார். கோர்டன் வாய்ஸின் மறுமொழி கூறிய பொழுது அவர் கூறியிருந்தார், தான் ஒரு குறுகிய பார்வையில் தான் அதை அவ்வாறு கூறுகின்றேன் என்று. அந்த அரசாங்கம் அந்த நிலப்பரப்புகளை மீட்டெடுப்பதற்கு புலிகளுடன் சண்டை பிடித்து அந்த மீட்டெடுப்பது சரியானது என்பதை அவர் குறுகிய பார்வையில் தான் அதை கூறியிருந்தார் தன்னுடைய புத்தகத்தில். புத்தகத்தை எழுதியதுக்கு காரணம் அங்கே பல அனர்த்தங்கள் நிகழ்ந்திருந்தன. அதை ஒரு பரந்த நோக்கில் மக்கள் எல்லோருக்கும் சென்றடைய வேண்டும் என்ற நோக்கத்தில் தான் எழுதியிருந்தார். அவருடைய தனிப்பட்ட கருத்துக்கள் சிலதுகள் இருக்கின்றன. அவர் தனியாக அதை மக்களுடன் பேசுவதற்கு தயாராக உள்ளார். அதே நேரத்தில் ஒரு பொறுப்பான ஒரு அதிகாரியாக இருந்து பேசும்பொழுது பரந்த அளவில் எல்லா மக்களுக்கும் உரிய ஒரு நிலைப்பாடு தான் அவர் கொள்ள வேண்டியிருக்கின்றது.
Okay, now a lot of people in the audience want us to talk about Australia's treatment of refugees generally and refugees from Sri Lanka and the legality of that. But I want to ask a question which is really preliminary to that in some degree. Now we have people like the Australian Foreign Minister Bob Carr saying that asylum seekers from Sri Lanka are really economic refugees, and we have an ongoing practice by the Australian government to send selected asylum seekers who arrive on Australia's shores back summarily without going through any more detailed process under the Refugee Convention or under the Migration Act. So the question that I'm passing on really is, how are ordinary Tamils experiencing life in Sri Lanka now 4 years after the end of the Civil War? And how are people who are being summarily sent back being treated, not when they land at the airport necessarily, but 6 months or 12 months after? What's the sort of threat that's hanging over them? So how are people affected on the ground in Sri Lanka now as opposed to in May 2009?
Well, there'll be lots of people in this room who know that better than I do, I think, because everyone has family, everyone who's Sri Lankan has family back in Sri Lanka. You know, and it's one of the things that I did at the end of my book is I painted a prognosis of what I thought Sri Lanka would look like around about now. And surely enough, it's come to pass. I mean, the government did not demobilise troops at the end of the war, it doubled the armed forces. And it sent them into the north and east of the country, the predominantly Tamil areas, to occupy those areas. They've established military camps that I believe are a precursor to breaking up the historically contiguous areas of Tamil lands in Sri Lanka. And then I think it is a kind of ethnic cleansing of the type that slow-burning ethnic cleansing of the type that one sees in the West Bank. And I speak from first-hand experience when I talk about the West Bank and Gaza. And the difference being that it's extremely well documented in Israel, and it's really hidden in Sri Lanka. But I sat down at the end of the war and sort of thought, well, now if I'm a sort of Sinhalese Buddhist nationalist, what would I do at this point in time? And I think it's fairly obvious what is happening. You're not going to see, you know, people burning down villages and booting people off their lands. It's done administratively, and it's done over time, and it's done, you know, according to a larger view of the way Sri Lanka should be run by the majority. As to some of the specifics about what's happening on the ground in Sri Lanka, I have been in contact with researchers on the ground, some of whom are Australian, who tell me that the practice of sexual violence against the Tamil community is pretty rife. Now listen, this is not just a Sri Lankan thing, it happens all over the world. Wherever boys have guns and they're dressed in uniforms and they occupy areas, they abuse the women. Unless there is a very tight command and control structure that restricts that, and I don't think that's going on in Sri Lanka. So I think there's a lot of brutalisation, particularly of women, in the Tamil areas, and I think that is one reason why people are coming to these shores, because often a young man or young woman who might have been involved with the Tamil Tigers is targeted by the security forces, and one of the ways that you extract the fruits of occupation is you threaten family members with, you threaten a male with interrogation, or you say, I'd like to spend half an hour with your sister. And so the choice made by some Tamils is to leave Sri Lanka as a result of that. And that, in my view, constitutes a real fear of persecution. But I think that it is individual. As many people arrive on these shores, it is individual at the reasons as to why they have arrived. I have been told by Tamils who translate in the camps for Tamils, and this is not a popular view, that about 2/3 of the people arriving are not genuine asylum seekers. Now, I think that's a really important distinction, because on one hand we have the extreme wings of the refugee lobby who are saying everyone is entitled to asylum. And the problem with that is that when people understand that there are actually economic migrants amongst this, it waters down the possibilities of genuine asylum seekers being granted asylum. And I think it's incredibly dangerous. So we need to recognise in real terms the profiles of the people who are arriving on our shores. Australians are entitled to have a sense of security over their borders. It's obviously a hot button political issue, but at the same time, contradictory position is we need to protect people who are entitled to our legal protection, and particularly in a country which is one of the wealthiest in the world. So as the UN High Commissioner for Refugees has noted in their latest report in December 2012, the categories of people actually eligible for refugee status are growing in Sri Lanka, not diminishing. But the actual profile of people and the industry that is involved in sending people here by boat is a very different issue. But our politicians, I think, are not describing this to us well, and it's leading to dangerous confusion, and confusion that results in the loss of human life, which I think is unforgivable.
Charles? Some things are complex, some things are not. Clearly that there are, that people can have a variety of reasons for fleeing. Normally people are only sort of risk death if they're concerned about death. But in any case, it's a simple counterfactual. If in fact the majority of refugees from a particular area would in fact, under a fair process, independent process, be adjudged not to be refugees, then wouldn't it be much simpler to actually engage in that process? I think that the fact that, if you really believe that, you would actually sort of put them through that process, and most of them would then be able to be sent home perfectly legal under the convention, as we saw with the from Tampa onwards. The thing is that most of them were found to be genuine refugees, and if you thought otherwise, why waste all this money? I object to all this money being spent, which we're a wealthy country, but we won't remain wealthy if we keep on throwing away our money on things that are no good for us and no good for those refugees. And I use refugees because statistically they are almost all found to be refugees. I can't stand people smugglers are actually hardly those who are subject to praise. I'd actually deal with it in a slightly different way. I'd treat it as if you actually send somebody out in a boat that's got a leak you don't know about, there's negligence and you might be subject to manslaughter. If you send them out in a boat that you actually know is unseaworthy, that's reckless, and if they die, that's murder in most jurisdictions. And I think that we should emphasise that the crime is not to actually take people to Australia when they are not certain that those people are refugees. There's no basis, in my view, of we might create a criminal offence, but that is actually allowing them to do what is within their rights. What the crime is actually putting people in a dangerous boat. And I think that we should emphasise that. The Indonesians who occasionally lose inter-island ferries, and throughout the whole archipelago of Philippines and Indonesia, there are ferries that go down. I think we should look at it in the same terms and work with them on the question of safety of life at sea, rather than the fact that they're actually transporting people for which if actually proven, is a perfectly legitimate reason. It is true that we have a right to control our borders, but the thing is we have voluntarily entered into an international treaty which actually imposes some limits on that. None of the Vienna Convention of Treaties, we can repudiate that. There's a very clear means by which we can repudiate the UN Convention on Refugees, but we haven't done it. And so we have, by not repudiating our treaty obligations, continue and affirm them. And so it is not true that we have complete control of our borders, because we have voluntarily agreed to allow asylum seekers to cross over them. And it's a humane thing. It's part of what I like to consider being an Australian, and is what civilised countries have been doing for the last 2,500 years.
John, what do you think of the way that the politicians are managing the whole thing cross-party?
Well, there seems to be a bipartisan approach to treat this as a political football. I think that I won't make comments on politicians and their motivations, because I'm not a politician and I don't know what motivates them. Well, I said I don't know.
I'm sorry.
Some of my best friends are politicians. No, I mean, and I think that it's an unfortunate thing is that this has actually come into the political discourse, and it's now extremely difficult for them to get out of it. But I actually think that there's a decent approach that we actually can take, and I wish that the politicians could join together. So I suspect the number of people who really enjoy this is very small, but they feel that they actually have to go along with this. There are deep wells of racism within Australia. There was I remember very well growing up in white Australia, and I remember the snide comments made about not just an Indigenous football scholar at my school, but also about Jews, which actually we regard as totally unacceptable these days. We actually had a great flowering and recognition. We benefited enormously from bringing in a lot of refugees, but a lot of people thought that Australia, okay, isn't it wonderful? You teach our kids songs about multiculturalism. We all watch interesting, or some of us watch interesting films on SBS, and everybody else tolerates. Isn't it wonderful? 150 years of racism has suddenly disappeared. There are deep wellsprings of racism in Australia, and I do not like it if a politician plumbs those depths for political advantage. But once it's done, because those deep wellsprings are there, it's actually very sad. But that's where I think that I'd like to see some politicians take the lead, and if they won't take the lead, others should.
The Centre would like to summarise about the 10 things.
Okay, I'll try that. பொப்கா கூறியது போல அகதிகள் இங்கே வரும் அகதிகள் பொருளாதார நிலைமையில் தான் இங்கு வருகிறார்களா அல்லது உண்மையிலே அவர்கள் அகதிகளா என்று கேட்டிருந்தார். சாதாரண மக்களின் நிலைமை என்ன, இலங்கையில் உள்ள சாதாரண மக்களின் நிலைமை என்ன, அதே நேரத்தில் திருப்பி அனுப்பப்பட்ட மக்களின் நிலைமை என்ன, 2009ஆம் ஆண்டுக்கு முன்னர் உள்ள நிலைமையை ஒப்பிடும் பொழுது அங்கே திருப்பி அனுப்பப்பட்டவர்களின் நிலைமை எவ்வாறு என்று கேட்டிருந்தார். அதுக்கு கோடன் வாய்ஸ் தன்னை விட இங்கே இருக்கும் பலருக்கு அதற்கான விடை தெரிந்திருக்கும் என்று கூறிய வேளையில் இராணுவ முகாம்களை அரசாங்கம் நிறுவி மக்களை பிரிப்பதற்கு முயற்சி செய்து கொண்டிருக்கிறார்கள். அதே நேரத்தில் இன ஒழிப்பை நடத்தவும் அங்கே நடவடிக்கைகள் நடந்து கொண்டிருக்கின்றன. இஸ்ரேல் போன்ற நாடுகளில் இது நடந்தாலும் அங்கே உள்ளவர்கிட்ட அப்பட்டமாக எழுதப்பட்டுள்ளது, மற்றவர்களுக்கு தெரிகிறது. அதே நேரத்தில் இலங்கையில் இது மறைக்கப்பட்டிருக்கின்றது, மற்றவர்களுக்கு தெரியவில்லை. அங்கே உள்ள கிராமங்கள் எரிக்கப்பட்டோ அல்லது அங்கே உள்ளவர்களை வன்முறையாக எழுத்துவவர்கள் ஒன்றும் செய்யவில்லை. அரசியல் முறையில் நிலங்களை எப்படி தாங்கள் எடுத்துக்கொள்ளலாம் என்றுதான் அரசாங்கம் முயற்சி செய்து கொண்டிருக்கிறது. அதே வேளையிலே பாலியல் மீறல்கள் நடந்து கொண்டிருக்கின்றன. குடும்பத்தில் ஆண்களை பயமுறுத்துவதும் பெண்களை பாலியல் முறையில் பயமுறுத்தப்படுத்துவதும் ஒரு திட்டவட்டமான முறையில் அங்கே நடைபெற்றுக் கொண்டிருக்கிறது. இங்கே வருபவர்கள் அகதிகளாக இருந்தால் ஆஸ்திரேலிய அரசாங்கம் உரிய பாதுகாப்பு வழங்கத்தான் வேண்டும். அதே வேளையில் அவர்களை சரியாக விசாரித்து அவர்கள் உண்மையான அகதிகளா அல்லது பொருளாதார நிலைமை தான் வருகின்றார்களா என்று சரியாக விசாரிக்கப்பட வேண்டிய ஒரு நிலைமை இருக்கின்றது. சார்ல்ஸ் கூறியது போல கொலை செய்யப்படலாம் என்ற ஐயத்தில் அங்கே இருந்து இங்கே வருபவர்களை அகதிகளாக நாங்கள் ஏற்றுக்கொள்ளத்தான் வேண்டும். சரியான முறையில் விசாரிக்கப்படலாம் என்று ஒரு சரியான திட்டவட்டம் இருந்தால் அதன் முறையில் விசாரிக்கலாம். அதே நேரத்தில் இந்த படகுகளில் ஓட்டை உள்ள பழைய படகுகளிலே இங்கே அனுப்பி இங்கே வருபவர்களை சரியான முறையில் தண்டிக்கப்பட வேண்டிய ஒரு நிலைமை இருக்கின்றது. அதே நேரத்தில் அரசாங்கம் ஆஸ்திரேலிய அரசாங்கம் இந்த அரசியல் சதுரங்கத்தில் ஈடுபடாமல் சரியான முறையில் இந்த அகதிகளின் பிரச்சனைகளை விசாரிக்க வேண்டும் என்பதையும், அதே போல ஆஸ்திரேலியாவில் பல்கலாச்சாரம் பின்பற்றுவதற்கு பல முறைகள் கையாளப்பட்டுள்ளன. அதே போல இந்த அகதிகளின் நிலைமையை விளங்கப்படுத்துவதற்கான சரியான முறைகள் எடுக்கப்பட வேண்டும் என்று கூறியிருந்தார்.
And Dr. Santil, just before we go on, you might tell anybody who's in the audience and worried that the bus won't be leaving right at 9 p.m. It'll be waiting till the end of the forum. So you might tell people that.
இங்கே பஸ்ஸில் வந்தவர்கள் அவருடைய பஸ் சரியாக 9 மணிக்கு இங்கேருந்து புறப்பட மாட்டாது. இந்த நிகழ்வு முடிந்த பின்னர் தான் புறப்படும். ஆகவே அதை பற்றி யோசிக்க வேண்டாம் கூறுறேன்.
Now, we are getting close to running out of time anyway. This is probably close to my last series of questions. And a series of questions sort of dealt with how do we bring the Sri Lankan government to account. Now, one stream of that was sort of the activist lament that we should never listen to, which was sort of to the effect that we just seem to find ourselves talking all the time. What can we do other than just talk? Part of the series of questions is international legal in nature, and that is what are the formal mechanisms by which Sri Lanka can be brought to account in international law. But I thought, Gordon, it might be useful at this stage to start that particular discussion by talking about, I forget what it's called exactly, the International Evidence Project.
Oh, right, yes.
The rest of that project. So you might, a good way to start talking about those issues of what can be done might be to talk about what's being done in that regard.
Sure. Okay. What's going to happen? Yeah, I mean, look, international relations moves at a glacial pace, and for any outside observer, it's almost impossible to detect it. It's slow reptilian in pace and just about as exciting in appearance. But nevertheless, there are actually developments. But they've taken actually a shorter period of time than I thought they would. I was sort of thinking about a 5 to 10 year period framework when I left Sri Lanka. But in fact, it's moved much faster than that. The thing to watch for, I think, is the fact that the government of Sri Lanka has not complied with very specific undertakings it gave to the UN Secretary General and importantly, to the Indian government. In fact, it's reneged on agreements. And that has a particular effect on international partners to whom you're looking for support in international fora. And the particular forum that I'm thinking of is the UN Human Rights Council. When I first left Sri Lanka, everyone said India will never withdraw its support from Sri Lanka. They never, because the Chinese are in there and there's competition for influence and all the rest of it. Well, lo and behold, last March, there was a resolution in the UN Human Rights Council in which India turned its back on Sri Lanka and voted with the American-backed resolution, and now there is a political timetable in place for Sri Lanka to come up with some answers about what happened at the end of the war, and to come up with a political solution which satisfies the grievances of the Tamil community who went to war. That resolution is due to come up for consideration next March in the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Again, merely to say the words makes you sort of stifle a yawn, because the UN appears to do, you know, often to outsiders, UN appears, and UN action appears sort of undetectable. But nevertheless, there has been a lot of progress in that regard going through the Human Rights Council. I'm personally involved with a project called the International Crimes Evidence Project, which is supported by some international governments here in Australia and by some significant international foundations. That organisation is staffed and advised by experts from the Hague Tribunal and other international bodies, forensic experts and military forensic experts and investigators and prosecutors. And that organisation, it's quite public, you can go on and have a look at the Public Interest Advocacy Group in Sydney. That organisation is involved in compiling a brief of evidence according to international criminal legal standards in support of some of the activities that are going on around the Human Rights Council resolution that's coming up in March. What's actually going to happen in Sri Lanka? My guess is that the Sri Lankan government is not going to change in the next few months. And I think it's really interesting to watch the movements inside some of the governments, particularly the US government, and for example, the appointment of Samantha Power, who wrote the book America in the Age of Genocide, as the ambassador to the UN. She's been nominated as the ambassador to the UN. I think that's a significant sign of change, of the change of influence of human rights as a pillar of American foreign policy in the US government at the moment. We can all argue the rights and wrongs of what the US does internationally and all the rest of it. I'm being very narrow at looking at the way I think Sri Lanka is going to go.
Hard to tell. I'd say history, the reptilian place you described, I often say that history is a long game. But a lot's happened since the 17th century, when virtually all states, sovereign states, were highly repressive, and those that weren't recognised were just as repressive outside of Europe. There's been enormous changes over the last 50, 60 years. I talk about the UN project. Dag Hammarskjöld is famous for having said the UN wasn't created to bring heaven on earth, but to prevent hell on earth. And actually, think about what the UN has done. It hasn't done what some people hoped, but it's actually put, in many cases, a floor under human misery. The extent of casualties in wars is actually less. Before the Second World War, firstly, war was a legitimate end of state policy. War was politics carried on by other means. It is no longer. War, pestilence, and famine were the three of the horses of the apocalypse. The UN has managed to it hasn't ended all wars, but it's ended the really big wars. It hasn't ended hunger or even starvation, but the extent of mass starvation is much, much less. When it comes to health, not everybody is healthy, but the number of the incidence of diseases has been massively reduced. And when it comes to refugees, it's a very, very imperfect scheme, because although everyone is regarded as having a right to asylum, nobody has a duty to provide. Nonetheless, there are processes by which people can flee, and the thing is they're not actually, even when we treat them much worse than we should, the thing is that there is still an opportunity for them to leave. And so, as I say, history's a long game. More has been achieved in the last 70 years than people recognise. But more can be achieved, and only be achieved when we keep on the pressure. I don't know whether this particular government will be held to account. I think it's more likely that subsequent governments will change their behaviour because of pressure put on this one. But constantly reminding people that it's not good enough, constantly trying to pressure our politicians to shun those who behave in these ways and to create stronger institutions to prevent it, and especially to say to our friends as well as our enemies, these are standards that you must follow. That is the way that history's game is actually going to move forward rather than backwards, which is always possible. So I think that history's a long game. More has been achieved in 70 years than we would have ever had a right to hope, and even more could be achieved in the next 70 years. I hope that in 20 years or so, that these kinds of behaviours will be totally beyond the pale. It might be 40 years, but in human history, that's a very short time. But we've got to work for it.
Just on Jill.
ஓகே, இலங்கை அரசாங்கத்தை சட்ட ரீதியாக எவ்வாறு அவர்களை ஒரு நடுநிலைமைக்கு கொண்டு வரலாம், அவர்கள் மீது எவ்வாறு நடவடிக்கை எடுக்கலாம் என்ற கேள்வி விடுக்கப்பட்டிருந்தது. கோர்டன் வாய்ஸ் கூறியது போல குறுகிய காலத்திலே பல விடயங்கள் நடந்துள்ளன. ஐக்கிய நாடுகள் சபையும் இந்தியாவும் போட்ட ஒப்பந்தம், இலங்கையுடன் போட்ட ஒப்பந்தம் முறியடிக்கப்பட்டது. இந்தியா எப்பொழுதுமே இலங்கை அரசாங்கத்துடன் ஆதரவை கொடுத்து கொண்டிருக்கும் என்றுதான் எல்லோரும் நினைத்து கொண்டிருந்தார்கள். ஆனால் இப்பொழுது யுஎனில் பாதிக்கப்பட்டவர்களுக்கு சரியான நடவடிக்கை எடுக்க வேண்டும் என்ற ஒரு நிலைப்பாட்டை இந்திய அரசாங்கம் எடுத்துரைத்திருக்கின்றது. அதே போல் இன்டர்நேஷ்னல் கிரைம் எவிடன்ஸ், அதாவது சர்வதேச போர் சாட்சியங்கள் என்ற ஒரு மையத்தை ஆரம்பித்திருக்கிறார்கள். அந்த மையம் வந்து பல சாட்சியங்களை, போர் நடந்த பொழுது இருந்த பல சாட்சியங்களை இன்னும் சேகரித்துக் கொண்டிருக்கின்றது. போரின் போது பாதிக்கப்பட்ட சார்ஸ் கூறியது போல போரின் போது பாதிக்கப்பட்ட யுஎன் ஐக்கிய நாடுகள் சபை வந்து இந்த கடந்த பல வருடங்களே பல மாறுதல்களை கொண்டு வந்துள்ளது. போரினால் பாதிக்கப்பட்ட மக்களின் எண்ணிக்கை குறைந்துள்ளது கூறலாம். வறுமை பல நாடுகளிலே நீக்கப்பட்டுள்ளது. எனவே கடந்த 70 வருடங்களிலே பல சாதனைகள் செய்யப்பட்டிருக்கின்றன. எனவே அழுத்தங்களை தொடர்ந்து கொடுத்து கொண்டிருந்தால், அரசியல்வாதிகளுக்கு அழுத்தங்களை தொடர்ந்து கொடுத்து கொண்டிருப்பதன் மூலம் இதற்கான நடவடிக்கைகளை இலங்கை அரசாங்கத்திற்கு எதிரானவோ அல்லது இலங்கை அரசாங்கத்தை சரியான முறையில் நடக்க பண்ணக்கூடிய நடவடிக்கைகளை எடுக்க முடியும் என்று கூறியுள்ளார்.
The one topic that I think Charles did touch on, but people wanted to discuss, but we've run out of time, was the lawfulness of Australia's responses to asylum seekers, the lawfulness of the idea of cutting off Australia from itself in order to do the discussions to ministers to send people over to Nauru and asylum, etc. But we don't have time to go into that. One thing I did want to mention is, I was just wondering if Father Pan Jordan might just stand up. Charles, just in terms of your centre and the law faculties generally and lawyers' organisations, Father Jordan spends a lot of his time trying to find pro bono lawyers who can act for people who've been refused by the RRT tribunals. There does seem to be better organisation of that in other states. Doesn't seem to be a great organisation here. It drives Father Jordan mad. It's a thankless and difficult task. But I thought that you might be able to assist with getting a dialogue going among the law faculties and among lawyers' organisations, including Australian Lawyers for Human Rights, to try and get more volunteers available to do that sort of work. So that was, I thought we wouldn't discuss that as a group, but I thought I'd raise that. And really remains just to thank everybody. I want you to thank all of the volunteers who contributed to tonight. I mentioned some of them earlier. I'd like you to thank the organising committee led by Marie Clem, and I mentioned some of the other members of that earlier, and the organisations who came together in a cooperative way to make tonight work. I'd particularly like you to thank our speakers, Dr. Gordon Weiss and And I think the most important thank you for tonight, for tackling the most difficult job of all, goes to Dr. Jeevan Sampford. And give yourselves a great round of applause, because it's tremendous to come out and discuss these important issues on a cold night in Brisbane winter. Congratulations and thank you to everyone.